How beautiful is that? That's called Nigun Hasulam by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Efrat in the Holy Land. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? We're so excited. Shabbos is almost here. We can wish each other a vivid and vibrant good Shabbos. Let's light up the darkness. It is also Elul, of course. The last month of the year, we're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. We blow the shofar every day. Since today's show is at noon, I didn't do a separate shofar blowing this morning. So let's do that now. The wake-up call to examine our deeds and get ready for Rosh Hashanah when the whole world, every soul in the world, comes before the heavenly court to receive a decree for the coming year. With us on this fine Friday. James Roth with us from Indianapolis. Paula Schmidt-Klauser listening and learning in Chicago. Pauline Michael from Arkansas. Guy Thomas Kennedy, Dayton, Ohio is with us now. Nancy Brundemel Wright, Southern Pines, North Carolina. Allison St. Clair from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Joy Lynn saying Shabbat Shalom from New Jersey. Amy Kulesa, hello from Frederick, Maryland. Sarah Les says hello from Germany. Welcome, Sarah. Helena Hemela, greetings from Finland. Great to see you, Helena. Lisa Gilman, Arlington, Mass says hello. Farid Abdich says congratulations. Stephanie Marie Diaz says Shabbat Shalom. Melissa Itel Jurin with us from Great Neck, New York. Jan Schwartz says Shalom. And Shabbat Erev from the Czech Republic. Wow. Shani Rosenberg is with us saying Shabbat Shalom. Patrice Carter from St. George, Utah. Barry Cowan, greetings from Sacramento. Steve Weinstein from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A name I can't read. Perhaps that's the Thai language. Says best of luck. And Shani Rosenberg is with us from Colorado. Over on the YouTube side, Edith is with us from New York City. And Brad Gross says hello from Louisville, Kentucky. All right, so we've got an incident here. We're going to be finishing, with God's help, our study of chapter 2 here in Tractate Eruvin. We're on page 26. That's Daf Chuf Vav. Wait, let me just make sure we're on 26. Yeah, we're on page 26. So Daf Chuf Vav. And we've been talking about the fourth mission, chapter 2. It's the last mission in this chapter, so we're going to end chapter 2 today. Let's see if we have learned enough about eruv generally and about the karpef, this enclosure that was not made for the purpose, or that is not a residential enclosure. It may have been created as a residential enclosure originally, and we've seen how that affects the law. So let's see if we've learned enough about the karpef and about the nature of the sages themselves to understand what went down in this incident. Okay, so it happened once that the Exilarch, so if we're talking about the Exilarch, meaning like the patriarch, like the monarch, but in exile, so we're talking about the Jewish community in Babylonia, in Bavel, and the Exilarch is the head, like the sort of like the king in exile, the government in exile, so the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia. And he was very wealthy and very powerful, and he was one of the sages as well. So the Exilarch in this story is not named. It might have been Mar Ukva, for example, or one of the other Exilarchs. There were several generations of them in the Talmudic period. At any rate, the Exilarch was hosting a big Shabbos lunch at his place. And there were going to be a lot of sages present. And the way that his place was arranged, let's say that this was, nice weather. Maybe it's too hot in the summer. Maybe it's a spring or fall type of Shabbos. And the Exilarch, he's got a vast mansion, estate, etc. So on that property somewhere, he's got an orchard, so it's got a bunch of trees there. It's called an orchard. I'm not so sure that it's a functioning orchard in the sense that there are fruit trees or nut trees or olive trees that are being harvested for their crop. I think in this case, the word orchard is just implying that there's a lot of trees in it, okay? So he's got this enclosed area, his orchard, but it was not originally enclosed as a residential area. That's key. Within that enclosure, which has a bunch of trees in it, he also has a pavilion. So it's a pavilion, and here the Koran Talmud refers to it as a banqueting pavilion. So you can imagine it's he's a rich guy. He's got this pavilion, meaning it's like a tent or some kind of other structure, maybe even a permanent structure that has a roof but not walls. Okay, and so we just had that principle that it's going to be permitted to carry inside the pavilion because it's as if the edges of the roof extend down to the ground and create an enclosure. So inside the pavilion, carrying is going to be permitted. But the rest of this orchard, which is bigger than 2 beis seah, bigger than 5,000 square cubits, and not originally enclosed for residential purposes, so we cannot carry on Shabbos in the orchard. What the Exilarch wants is to host this lunch, this big lunch for a bunch of sages and other guests that are going to be there for Shabbos lunch, and he wants them to eat in the pavilion, and he wants to be able that his servants can carry food and utensils and whatever else is necessary for the lunch during the meal back and forth between the house and the pavilion. And since we know you're not allowed to carry in the orchard, right, because this is a karpef, it's an enclosure that's non-residential, it was not originally enclosed to be residential, and it's bigger than that maximum size, which you can either look at as 2 beis seah, or which is the amount of area needed to grow 2 measures of grain, or 5,000 square cubits, which is the exact proportions, exact measurements, the exact area of the courtyard of the tabernacle in the wilderness. In any case, we can't carry in the enclosure. So how are we going to have an arrangement where the servants of the Exilarch can carry the food back and forth from the house to the lunch in the pavilion? He goes to Rav Huna bar Chinana, or ben Chinana. No, bar. Rav Huna bar Chinana. So Rav Huna, there's several Rav Hunas. So this is Rav Huna, the son of Chinana, right? So Rav Huna bar Chinana. Presumably he's senior in some way, or the Exilarch wouldn't have asked him to make this arrangement. Rav Huna bar Chinana says, okay, I understand what you want to do. He goes and he erects basically temporary partitions along a path between the house and the pavilion through that enclosure where carrying would otherwise not be permitted. So he's essentially created a mavoy, an alleyway, right? He's created a path that is lined with a partition between the doorway of the house and the entrance to the pavilion. It's going to have that form of a doorway at each end. It's going to have partitions along the side. How does he do it? He takes reeds, right? So thin sticks, basically, and he sticks them in the ground. So it's not a permanent enclosure at all. It's just vertical sticks stuck into the ground, each within 3 handbreadths of each other. So we've had a discussion before that some say it's 3 handbreadths, some say it's 4 handbreadths. As long as it's for sure less than 3 handbreadths, those sticks that are neighboring each other are going to be considered as if they were touching. That's what we call that concept of lavud, right? That within 3 handbreadths, it's as if they were touching because that's an insignificant distance. Where do we get 3 tefachim? That was the distance from the ground or between 2 gates that a goat could easily slip through. So if it's closer than that, it counts as if it's a solid fence. So Rav Huna bar Chinana fulfilled the request of the Exilarch that now we have an alley between the house and the pavilion that people are going to be able to carry on Shabbos to take the food and utensils out there for the nice lunch, the beautiful Shabbos lunch that the Exilarch wants to host in the pavilion. Everything is peachy keen. What's the problem? So it really cracks me up, this whole story. So what happens then is that Rava, who is a very senior and important sage, and we've talked about his rulings many times, he comes here and he sees this alleyway through an enclosure that contains within it this pavilion. Now, according to Rava, this pavilion is a dwelling. It's a permanent structure. It has a roof. People can eat inside of it. This counts as a dwelling. You could even sleep there if you wanted to. The fact that it doesn't have sidewalls doesn't matter because we extend down from the edges of the roof over the pavilion. So since the enclosure, this orchard, as it were, that's full of trees, contains a dwelling within it, we don't need this fence, essentially, this temporary fence that's erected along this path from the house to the pavilion. And Rava was afraid that this would be misleading to others, that they would think that in a similar situation you can't carry in the enclosure even though it has a dwelling in it. So what does Rava do? Without talking to anybody else and not even talking to Rav Huna bar Chinana, he goes and he just knocks the sticks out of the ground along the path between the house and the pavilion. And not only does he knock the sticks down, but his two students, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, who will eventually become great sages in their own right, but at this stage, they're young and they're students of Rava. Well, they are his students. They're very dedicated to him. And now that Rava has knocked down those sticks, they don't want Rav Huna bar Chinana to come by and put the sticks back up on Friday afternoon, which, would be considered some kind of an insult to Rava. So what do? They go behind Rava and pick up all the sticks, so they're not even going to be there and available for Rav Huna bar Chinana to put to erect the partitions again along this path in case he should get that idea. Okay, so at the end of Friday, there's no partitions along the pathway between the house and the pavilion. Comes Shabbos day, and they're going to start bringing the stuff out for the lunch in the pavilion. Another sage who is present, named Ravina, looks at this situation and he says, whoa, we've got a problem here. We all agree that this enclosure here of the orchard was originally built not for residential purposes. The fact that there's a pavilion here now tells us that the pavilion was built later. Right? It's not that the pavilion was here and then we put a fence around it. Rather, there was a fence around this enclosure and then the pavilion was built. So Ravina brings a case from another body of law, and we're going to be talking more about this in the coming days. We've already mentioned it a little bit. It's this idea of the Shabbos boundary. There's a limitation to how far you can walk on Shabbos once you've gone out of a city, right? So if you're out in the country to begin with, it's how far you can go from your dwelling. If you start in a city, well, once you reach the city boundary, you can only go beyond that another 2,000 cubits on Shabbos, unless you've established that your dwelling is somewhere outside the city by leaving a basket of food before Shabbos. Then you might be able to walk a little further. But the point is, for that body of law, from where do we measure the edge of a city? Ravina teaches that we have a teaching that if it's a new town, in the case of a new town, we measure from the settled area, and in the case of an old town, we measure from the wall of the city. So let's explain that. What is a new town? A new town means that first they built the city walls, And then they placed the settlement in, they started building the houses inside. An old town means that there was some kind of a settlement of homes and residences, and later they built the wall around it, right? So the new town, you can imagine like one of these planned communities, like where they're going to just build a suburb from scratch. You see this in the LA area all the time when you drive out to Canyon Country. There's like a big strip of desert, and then some developer buys, thousands of acres, and then he builds hundreds of homes and puts in the roads and everything. It's like a big planned community, and you can see what the boundary of the whole planned community is going to be. But he might only build one portion of that at first, one of the neighborhoods within the big planned community, and people might already start moving in and buying those houses, and that sort of funds the developer to keep building out other sections of the planned community. That would be like a new town. From where do we measure the edge of such a town? Not from the outer edge of what's the planned community, but rather the part that is settled already. How does this apply to the pavilion and the Shabbos lunch by the home of the Exilarch? According to Rav Huna, this is like a new town. In other words, the enclosure was built first, right? We know that. This was an enclosure built not for the purpose of a residence. The residence was added later. And the way this gets applied to the idea of an enclosure for a karpef is that it's not valid to carry throughout that enclosure just because you add a dwelling to it. You're still going to have to make some kind of an adjustment to the partition, to the fence that goes around it, since it was built not as a residential enclosure at the beginning. Adding the residence isn't enough. We've seen that. How do you do this? How do you change that fence? You would tear down, let's say, 11 cubits of that fence, linear cubits, and rebuild it. And it's like once you tear down more than 10, it's like you don't have a fence around the enclosure. Then you repair some of it, and you can even leave a 10 cubit opening as the entrance. But now it's like you have a new fence. And this time the fence was added for a residential enclosure. That was never done before, says Rav Huna. So this is not an enclosure with this is not a residential enclosure, even though it has that pavilion in it. Therefore, we can't carry throughout the enclosure. If Rav Huna bar Chanina's alley with the two fences alongside it, made with the temporary fence made of reeds stuck along the side, within 3 handbreadths of each other, this row of sticks, that would have worked, and then we could have our lunch. But because Rava and his students knocked down those 2 fences and took away the sticks, and it wasn't standing on Friday, okay, so now we can't carry stuff from the house out to the pavilion. And once the students of Rava saw that there was a problem and that they had created along with their teacher, they said, come to think of it, that's not the only problem. In fact, there's another problem, says Rav Papa. And he says it to his teacher, to Rava. He says, come to think of it, there's another problem. Wasn't the fence that was built around this orchard, it wasn't built even to create an enclosure. It was built for the sake of privacy. This is just a detail that gets added at this point in the story. But it wasn't built to be an enclosure. It was built for the sake of privacy. I think maybe that's how we know that this isn't an orchard that's a productive orchard. The fence was just built for the privacy of the Exilarch. So such a fence does count to permit carrying within it. That would have been okay if it was less than 5,000 square cubits in area, right? If it was within the maximum size. But since it's bigger than that, it's the fence itself, the privacy fence, is not going to permit carrying. And such a fence, even if the dwelling was built at the same time, since the fence was built for privacy and not as an enclosure, it still wouldn't count. Right? Even if the pavilion was there from the beginning, it wouldn't have counted because it's a privacy fence, and a privacy fence cannot create a residential enclosure. It can be used for carrying, but this enclosure is too big to use it for carrying. We need this to be a residential enclosure. It wasn't originally built as a residential enclosure. And even if we could somehow say that this new town rule doesn't apply, it still isn't going to work because it's a privacy fence, not an enclosure fence. And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, also says to his teacher Rava, yeah, we heard the same teaching from Rav Asi. Screens that are built for privacy or even for shade, if it's a small enclosure, we can use them to justify carrying. But in a large enclosure, they're not going to be sufficient to call this a residential enclosure. So yeah, there's no way that we can carry here. And the Exilarch here's this whole discussion about points of law and how residential versus non-residential, privacy versus shade versus enclosure, etc. The end of the day, as far as the Exilarch is concerned, what really matters here is that lunch is canceled in the pavilion. They can't have the nice lunch in the pavilion that he was planning, and that he had even been careful to make arrangements for by asking Rav Huna, the son of Chinana, to make arrangements so that they could have the lunch. And he did it. The guy built this nice alleyway with the fences along each side connecting the house and the pavilion. And Rava came along and didn't want people to get the wrong idea. And because he didn't have a discussion, because he took a unilateral action without going to Rav Huna bar Chinana and discussing with him, that's what Rava should have done. Maybe you could say, well, after he built the fence, he went home, and then Rava came, and there was no one to talk about it with, and they didn't have cell phones in those days. Okay, maybe. But the bottom line is, because Rava was so quick to act, and his students were so quick to support him, they got carried away, right, with what seemed like a good plan in the moment. Now it ruined everybody's lunch on Saturday, at least the ability to have it in the pavilion. And now they're all talking about, all the multiple reasons that they were wrong to do this on Friday. I mean, they're quick to cop to their own faults, right? Rava's student says, yeah, we were wrong, and we were even more wrong than we thought. But the Exilarch's comment on this situation is a great little quip. He quotes Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 22, and he says, they are wise to do evil, but to do good, they have no knowledge. That's normally a verse that's attributed to truly evil people who use their cleverness to do evil. But when it's time for them to do good, then suddenly they have no wisdom. But in this case, these rabbis who were being a little too clever, right? And overruled the arrangements that the Exilarch had made along with Rav Huna, it ruined the lunch. So a little humility on the part of Rava and his students on Friday would have gone a long way. And, they and everybody had to pay the price on Shabbos. Okay. If you have comments or questions, put them in the comments now. Just a couple more quick teachings, and then we're going to complete our discussion of chapter 2 here of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. All right. The last two things that we'll learn in this chapter, we return to it said in the Mishna that is the subject of our discussion right now. Excuse me, let me just get rid of that. It said that at the end of that Mishnah that Rabbi Elai said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer that this maximum size for which it's allowed to carry in a non-residential enclosure, the 5,000 square cubit limit, Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold by that. He says actually the karpef, the non-residential enclosure, can be much larger than that, 30 or even 40 times larger than that. But Rabbi Elai said nobody else seems to have heard Rabbi Eliezer teach that, so he remembers Eliezer taught it, but no one is giving him backup on that. But it said that in the Mishnah. Now we return and if Rabbi Eliezer actually said that, what would be his proof text? And so the Gemara points to a verse from second book of Kings, chapter 20, verse 4, which it says, what this concerns is the prophet Isaiah going to visit King Hezekiah, or Hezekiah. Isaiah, it says, and it came to pass before Isaiah was gone out into the middle courtyard that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, etc. So Isaiah was by the court of the king, and here the word that's used for the court of the king, it can also be translated as a courtyard. And from this we learn that it's a king's court, and a king's court is much larger than 5,000 square cubits. It can be. They can be very, 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 very large. Now that we're talking about this incident of Isaiah coming to visit Hezekiah, so in that incident, the king became very ill. What did the prophet Isaiah do? According to this history, at least the tradition passed down to the sages, Isaiah gathered a group of Torah scholars to learn Torah right outside the entrance to Hezekiah's residence, where he lay sick, right? Very sick, like dangerously ill, that he might die. And Hezekiah was a righteous king, and Isaiah was trying to save his life. How? By having a Torah learning in his honor. Now that is a great thing to do, right? And we still do that today when somebody's life is in danger because they're ill, or I've heard stories like somebody was in a car accident, and people are saying psalms for him all over the place, praying for this person that their life should be spared. And we can also learn Torah in the honor of the person whose life is endangered. And it's a beautiful thing to do, and perhaps the merit of that Torah learning, which is dedicated to saving the life of this person whose life is in danger, will result in, it's like whenever we're very ill, it's like our soul is actually on trial in heaven, and the outcome is uncertain, right? Anytime a person is very ill, and you can imagine the ancient world where, they had folk remedies that could help you, with headaches and skin rashes. But when somebody's life was in danger, infection, meningitis, who knows what kind of diseases, plagues, they really had nothing they could do for them except pray and learn in their honor. However, the Gemara comments on this incident that while it's good for a group of people to learn Torah in the honor of somebody whose life is in peril because they're ill, they shouldn't do that learning right at the entrance to the person's room or their residence. You should do that Torah learning somewhere else. Why? Because, like we said, when somebody is very ill, it's like their life hangs in the balance. They're actually undergoing a trial before the heavenly court. If your soul is on trial before the heavenly court and it's unclear whether you're going to be allowed, the soul's going to be allowed to proceed in its journey through this physical world and have a longer, human lifetime. When you're having a trial, who's the judge? God, okay. Who's the defendant? Okay, so the person who's sick. Who is the prosecutor? That's Satan, right? In English, Satan. So remember that if this is new to you, the Jewish understanding of Satan is not, some devil with a pitchfork who's just out here in the world trying to do evil to undermine God's creation. That's not Satan at all. Satan is an angel whose job it is to be the accuser, to be the prosecutor, to say to God, well, this person did this, 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 and this, and this. You can't forgive him. You can't. And then there's also a defense team, which is many, many, many angels, right? All the angels, every time we do a good deed, it's like an angel is created who becomes our advocate in these times of trial. So it's like we have tons of defense attorneys and just one prosecuting attorney. Although some would say that every time we make a sin, there's a spiritual force that's almost demonic in nature that will sort of be there at the prosecutor's table. But the lead prosecutor is Satan. So since Satan is near when a person is sick, you don't want to have the Torah learning be right there in that proximity where Satan is active. Why? Because it might provoke Satan to sort of prosecute the person even more harshly, and that this would result, it's like the Satan is going to be empowered to present an even more vigorous prosecution, and that might lead to the person losing their life. Or it might be that because the Torah learning is becoming very effective and it's right here in the vicinity, Satan might direct his attention over to the Torah scholars and sort of try to confuse them, right? Satan will do that in the world. He'll try to confuse us so that we lose our bearings, and they might end up producing a false or mistaken ruling in their Torah study. So it's good to do Torah study in the merit of somebody who's very ill, but we don't do it right at their bedside. Right at their bedside, they should have rest and caring and love and people caring for them. If he wants to do some Torah learning, great. But if we want to have an organized and vigorous Torah study in the merit of that person, do it somewhere else, according to this teaching. And finally, Rabbi Elai brings another teaching in the name of Rabbi Eliezer. So the first was that the karpef could be a lot bigger than the 5,000 square cubits. The second concerns a joint eruv in a courtyard. So if we have a situation where there's a big courtyard and there's several homes in it, so of course we can carry throughout that courtyard, but not exactly. Because there's multiple homes there, and sometimes multiple courtyards, so that residents have to join in an eruv together so that they can all carry throughout the courtyard. You can if you have a private courtyard, like, if you have a house and a yard, you can certainly on Shabbos carry from your house into your yard and back into your house. But if your yard is a joint courtyard for several homes, for you to be able to carry throughout the sort of joint courtyard, all the residents of the courtyard have to make an arrangement. And basically, it's like they all either place a little bit of food in a basket and deposit it in one of the homes, or they even, you can make the other people your agent so that they deposit a little bit of food on your behalf. And that joins all the courtyards. And that doesn't even have to be done every Shabbos. I think it can be done just once in a while. But the point is, in this teaching, that let's say that one of the residents forgot to join in the eruv. So that what Eliezer teaches is, well, that's okay. Everybody else can carry throughout the courtyard and the homes, but the one who didn't join in cannot, right? He can't carry anything from his house out into the courtyard. And this is provided that, because the whole eruv is going to fall apart unless he cedes authority to them. He has to say, okay, well, whatever my ownership is in my share of the public courtyard, the joint courtyard, you guys, I give you all authority, so that now everybody is, it's a joint authority now over his home and the courtyard, and so everybody else can carry throughout this courtyard. But the person who forgot to join in the eruv before Shabbos, he cannot. Then the rabbis say, well, no, it doesn't work that way. If 6 live in this courtyard, only 5 joined in the eruv, we don't have a full eruv, so now nobody can carry. So Rav Sheshet, with the clarification of Rava, says, no, that's not what happened. Of course, they can all carry throughout the courtyard, but what's going to happen is he has to give authority up. He has to say, it's okay with me. He's still not going to benefit. He can't join in that eruv, and he can't carry objects from his house out to the courtyard and back in. They will be able to. What the Eliezer and the rabbis differ about is whether he has to specifically give authority over his share of the courtyard to each of the other residents, or can he just make a blanket declaration in the presence of one or two of them and say, okay, I give up my authority over my share of the courtyard, and you guys can just use it for the purpose of the eruv. Eliezer says he can make the general statement. The rabbis say he has to make a specific ceding authority to each of the other residents. And I find it interesting that this ceding of authority can happen on Shabbos, right? Because saying to somebody, I give you authority over my property so that the eruv can be valid, that's pretty transactional, even if it's temporary in nature. You'd think that that's the sort of thing that would not be allowed on Shabbos. It's not a Shabbostic kind of, arrangement. It's a statement, because it's sort of like transferring a property right, even if it's temporary and limited. But as we saw when we had this discussion back in Tractate Shabbos, that whereas any talk of business is prohibited on Shabbos, except talk of business like I'm going to donate money, to the poor in this amount, like a pledge to charity, can be made on Shabbos. Why? Because it's for the purpose of a mitzvah. And so it seems to me that he's ceding authority on Shabbos. It's going to be valid. Why? Because it allows everybody to enjoy Shabbos more. So he's doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah of delighting in Shabbos. He didn't join in the eruv, so he's not going to be allowed to carry stuff in and out of his house into that courtyard, the joint courtyard. But the other people will, and they will even be able to carry objects in and out of his house because he gave them that authority on Shabbos. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let us look at questions and comments. Janine Mayer, aren't the eruvs in cities pretty bigger than the limits mentioned here? Yes, absolutely. But we have to keep remembering that the word eruv has multiple meanings. So when you're talking about a big city eruv, you're talking about a community eruv. That can be very large because first of all, it's being created for a residential purpose. We're creating one large residential enclosure, and the houses were there first, and then the enclosure went up, and then it's permitted to carry throughout that whole neighborhood, or in the case of LA, like a large portion of the city. But the eruvs that we're talking about here are a little bit different. There's just an enclosure for the purpose of a non-residential area, this garden or storage enclosure, or in the case that we're just talking about at the end here, the courtyards with houses within them. Like, they didn't create a big community eruv, right? They didn't go out and put up the lechis, the side posts, and the koires, those cross beams on top, which sometimes are represented by fishing line. But none of that was created, right? So since they didn't have that community eruv, so now they're just dealing with this kind of limited, much more specific eruv for a different purpose. Bill Eldridge. I don't buy even the tepid defense for Rava here. He had 2 students. He could have sent one as a messenger. I agree. Who are we to criticize Rava? So for all we know, there was other factors going on here. For all we know, there had recently been a debate in the community about a related situation, and Rava didn't want people to get the wrong idea. There's no question that I don't think he was trying to undermine Rav Huna bar Chinana by removing the fence that Rav Huna had set up. Rava's purpose was elevated, but I think there's definitely a human lesson here that we have to be careful. Even when our motives are good, we've got to be humble, right? Listen, I never talk about politics, and I'm not going to talk about politics now, except to say that in the heated environment that we're all living in right now, why do people feel so strongly? Because they fear for the future of the country, right? No matter which side of the aisle they're on, they care about the future of the country. But what we have to be careful about is remaining humble enough to say, we all care about the country. We all want the country to do well. We have such different ideas about how to achieve it. But if I'm so convinced that I'm right and that other people are wrong, I may come in my lack of humility to make an error that can really hurt everybody. So that humility is really necessary. And I shared earlier today one of those lines that we all learned together here on AT Daily back at Eruvin 13, the very famous debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the academies of Hillel, and the Academy of Hillel and the Academy of Shammai, who argued passionately about certain aspects of the law for years, and each side was 100% sure that they were right. Ultimately, a heavenly voice came and said that the students of Hillel, the law would follow the students of Hillel. Why? Because they were easy and forbearing, which is to say humble. They weren't so sure that they were right that they kind of would shout in the face of their opponents. And moreover, they taught the teachings of their opponents along with their own. And not only that, they taught the teachings of their opponents before their own, so that a listener could have a little bit more freedom to make up his own mind about the information that was being presented. And and what came out of that story was this teaching that I shared today in a little meme, that one who acts humbly, God will exalt him. But one who exalts himself, God will humble him. Right? And, for us people of faith, like, that is a strong and crucial teaching, right? If we act humbly, we may not get our way immediately today, but eventually the truth will out, right? But whereas if we're so convinced that we're right, that we're just going to run roughshod over the people around us and the people who disagree with us, we might eventually really get our comeuppance, and the whole system could suffer for it. And this is what happened here. Rava got his comeuppance, and the whole system suffered for it, because the lunch of the Exilarch was ruined, and nobody could eat in the pavilion, and all the plans that were made, etc., etc., etc. Final comment, Bill Eldridge says, joking aside, as an anarchist, I found today's story extremely helpful and illustrative. When one dwells in community, consensus and discussion of issues that affect the whole community are not optional, because even a wise and well-intentioned individual can make a grievous error. Thank you, Bill. I think you just summed up what I said quite beautifully. And I guess I'll make a final comment, and we can use this as a takeaway as we go into Shabbos. I will admit that I am the sort of person who hates to be bored. So, if you're ever sitting in committee meetings, boredom is a great danger, right? There's an old saying that, what is a committee? A committee is a group of individuals who individually can accomplish nothing, but can meet and collectively decide that nothing can be done. All joking aside, when you're sitting in a committee that's tasked with making a report or a recommendation or even undertaking an action on behalf of the community, okay, so everybody needs to be heard. And those meetings can just drag on and on and on. And there's always that one person who's going to add nothing of value, but needs to be heard and needs to be heard again and needs to be heard again. And, sometimes you could just be sitting in such a meeting like, oh, when is this going to end? But I think we can learn out a little bit from today's daf that, when we're sitting in a committee like that, and the purpose of the committee is to benefit the community, and everybody needs to be heard, that's holy work. It's holy work, right? And if we can reframe it in our minds that way, that, okay, letting everybody be heard, it's holy work, and just, paying attention and listening to everybody and not getting bored and certainly not being rude, it's divine service. It's a divine service, and it's like a sacrifice that I can make to just sit there and pay attention closely and not let myself slip into boredom. It's a true faith practice to remain engaged during a boring committee meeting. So let's all remember that. Looks like there's one last question that Nina slipped in from Sharon Fran Brooks. Is this food preparation like the eruv we do on a holiday for food preparation for Shabbat on holidays? Right. So when we have a 3-day holiday coming up, we recite a special thing that is going to allow us to do this food preparation on the holiday. It's definitely related, but again, this idea of the eruv, there are different kinds of eruvin, right? So there's different kinds of eruvin. The big community eruv, the little neighborhood eruv, the one that's about a boundary for the purpose of walking, and we're going to be studying that in chapter 3. But that one about food preparation, I know what you're talking about, and we recited it. I remember over Shavuos we had to do that, and we'll probably have to do it again for Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos this year, and then Sunday. So we're gonna want to cook on Sunday for Sunday night. We can't cook on Shabbos, even though we can cook on a holiday, but not if that holiday falls on Shabbos. So there's going to be some particularities with respect to that. Okay, my friends, you should all have such a beautiful Shabbos. I bless you. I bless all of us that tonight at our Shabbos tables, God willing, we're not alone. That we look around the people with us and we're grateful that we're there and we pay attention to them. And if we are alone, okay, so then, God willing, before Shabbos, we can make a connection with people we care about, wish them a good Shabbos, and not just call, hey, just call, say good Shabbos, gotta go, but take a moment to really engage with them and hear what they have to say. And as we've learned today, active listening can really be a piece of divine service. All the best and good Shabbos.